We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much. The Government's revenue and spending figures show that Scotland is in deficit to the tune of £12 billion, the equivalent of all our health spending. Oil revenues have gone down by more than £4 billion in just 1 year, the equivalent of all our spending on schools. If Scotland were independent, how would the First Minister cope with this revenue drop? By cutting services or raising taxes?
First Minister.
I don't know if Johann Lamont's come across the fact, but the United Kingdom is in deficit to tune of over £100 billion in the years she's noted. The key thing, and what we explored before, is who, in terms, is in a relatively stronger position. Johann Lamont knows, and we've discussed this many times, that both over the last 5 years that John Swinney has just mentioned, or indeed if we look over the last 30 years, then the answer is that Scotland has been in the stronger fiscal position relative to the United Kingdom. Now that, of course, is within the context of the United Kingdom. And our case for independence is that by marshalling the great natural resources of Scotland and the great human resources of Scotland, then we can build a fair and just society in this country. And since so many of the Better Together notaries have said on so many occasions that they don't doubt that Scotland is an economically viable, successful country, given that Standard & Poor's, not noted for their optimism and such things, said it only 2 weeks ago, can Johann Lamont not bring herself to concede that this country economically can build that prosperous and just future for the Scottish people?
Johann Lamont.
Well, all of that was very interesting, but it wasn't the question I asked him. Nothing new there. Because, of course, the First Minister in the past has criticised me, and then it appears today that he's saying that a £4 billion revenue drop is just a wee thing, something that we don't have to worry about. Because, of course, indeed, exactly. I've learned my lesson. You should maybe learn the same. Because the First Minister, of course, has talked of a stabilisation fund, but he could only put money in that by either cutting services or raising taxes. Last year, he said that Scotland had, and I quote, a relative surplus compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. Will he now confirm that the rest of the United Kingdom has a relative surplus compared to Scotland's relative deficit? And can he explain how he would maintain our schools when he has lost the equivalent of our entire schools budget? Would he cut services or raise taxes?
First Minister.
Well, I'm delighted that we'll no longer hear about the wee things. For those who didn't understand the allusion, that was when Johann Lamont seemed to think that employment policy, competition policy, control of oil and gas revenues, control of nuclear weapons were just the wee things. It wasn't matter that Scotland controlled. These, of course, are the big things. But now that lesson has been learned, then hopefully the something-for-nothing society will also disappear from the Johann Lamont lexicon. Now, let's take the position of the relative position of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. If we look at the years going backwards, yes, there was a £283 per head difference last year that was published yesterday. But there was a positive £489 difference the year before, £214 the year before that, £75 the year before that, and £1,100 in 2008-2009. That is a total of £1,600 per head. Over the last 5 years, that is how Scotland would have been relatively better off than the UK as a whole. Now, would it not be possible, given that Johann Lamont would concede that over that period of time, because it amounts to £8,000 million, that we could have borrowed less or invested more, or had the stabilisation fund to make sure that over that period we could use that wealth to benefit the people of Scotland? Or does she still think it's a wee thing that we would have been £8 billion better off, £1,600 per head?
Johann Lamont.
It's the First Minister who seems to be entirely relaxed about the fact that we have £4 billion less to spend on jobs, on education, on the support for our young people than we'd have otherwise. And it's something. This is a man who lectures us about economics and gives us an answer like that. Whole numbers and numbers which make no sense whatsoever. I'm not even asking the First Minister something difficult, like what currency would he raise taxes in? He doesn't know. Whether it's groats, bobbies or Armenian drams, in the last 12 months, Scotland has lost more than £4 billion of oil revenue. At the moment, that loss is borne across the United Kingdom because we're in the United Kingdom. If Scotland were outside the United Kingdom, I ask again, how would the First Minister pay for that loss in revenue? By cutting services or raising taxes?
First Minister.
Can I point out that Scotland loses out on £5.5 billion of oil revenues, because these are the oil revenues for the last year from Scottish waters that are siphoned down to the London Treasury. And over the last 30 years, that has been several £100 billion we've lost out on. And it is an indication of the strength of the Scottish economy that over the last 5 years we would have been £8 billion better off if we'd been running our own finances than having them run for us by London. Now, I know that Johann Lamont believes that oil and gas is a dreadful burden on the Scottish economy. There are many oil and gas producers around the world. Every single one of them regards the hydrocarbon industry and the revenues that flow from it as a valuable resource which they are benefiting from. Why is it, according to Better Together, Labour and Tory and Labour, that it is only Scotland for whom oil and gas is this incredible curse? And if over the last 5 years we would have been £8 billion better off, can't we all think of some wee things we'd like to have invested in the economy, like jobs for the people, like a fairer society? That's why her campaign to tell people in Scotland that they are too poor to be independent is going to get the same giant raspberry as it did in the Daily Record poll this morning.
Johann Lamont. Order. Ms Lamont.
I think that must be a record number of straw men that the First Minister has put up in order to defend himself, because, of course, I have never said that oil is a burden to Scotland, because without oil, Scotland's deficit would be £16 billion. And, you know, I think what we got from the First Minister there is what they call in TV quiz shows a pointless answer, although, in fact, it's charitable to call it an answer at all, because we know what he wouldn't do. We know what he wouldn't do. He wouldn't be able to borrow his way out of trouble, because who would lend to a country that had just walked away from its debts? He wouldn't.
Order.
And that's not scaremongering.
Order.
That is quoting the First Minister himself. Because he wouldn't. We also know that he wouldn't raise taxes on the rich, because he ruled that out last week. He wouldn't raise taxes on banks and big business, because he is committed to cutting tax for them lower than George Osborne. So I ask again, he has lost the equivalent of the entire school's budget. How would he pay for our schools? By cutting services elsewhere or raising taxes on every family in Scotland?
First Minister.
Johann Lamont
Order.
asked the question, who would lend money to an independent Scotland? As Standards & Poor's, the rating agency, noted 2 weeks ago, quote, even without North Sea oil and calculating per capita GDP only by looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for their highest economic assessment. Now, if an international rating agency can say that, can the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland not bring herself to say that? Of course, it was not so long ago since the Better Together parties told us we couldn't be independent because we'd lose our AAA rating. In fact, I've got the leaflet here. It went round the doors about the AAA rating. And then, of course, from two of the agencies, the UK lost their AAA rating. Now, the reason there is confidence from so many people in Scotland's economic prospects is looking at the figures that Johann Lamont's been given. Over the last 5 years, a relative surplus of £8 billion, £8 billion stronger than the UK as a whole, almost £1,600 ahead for every man, woman and child in Scotland. Johann Lamont didn't seem to appreciate the reference to the Daily Record poll this morning. It did show the highest, as they put it, support for independence recorded this year. It did show, as they put it, that the SNP were the most popular party by some considerable distance. But most interestingly of all, it showed that a quarter of the remaining Labour supporters in Scotland intend to vote for independence. Maybe one of the reasons is the miserable doom-lading running down of our country that Johann Lamont comes to every day of this week.
Question number 2. Order. Order. Question number 2. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans near future.
Ruth Davidson.
This time last year, the Finance Secretary John Swinney said that there was little doubt that Scotland was moving into a second oil boom. Yesterday, we found out that annual oil revenues dropped by 44%, leaving a £4.5 billion black hole. That's the price of funding every school in Scotland. But that black hole did not affect Scotland's public spending because, as part of the United Kingdom, we can absorb these shocks. We want the North Sea to produce more, and the UK Government is fast-tracking all recommendations from industry expert Sir Ian Wood to squeeze out every last drop. We have the support from the UK Government to keep the North Sea going, and we have the support of a nation with broad shoulders to absorb the shocks. Does the First Minister not accept that the last thing we need right now is to end both of these advantages?
First Minister.
Oh, I absolutely love that. We have the support of the UK Government to sustain the North Sea industry. The North Sea industry has been supporting the UK Government for the last 30 years. As this unbridled optimism of John Swinney in terms of the prospects for the North Sea, let me read David Cameron. North Sea oil, there are many, many years left for this great resource. It's a huge national advantage having such a brilliant oil and gas industry. Maybe, I know, John, yes, I shouldn't associate you with the Prime Minister in any shape or form whatsoever. How come it's such a huge advantage for the United Kingdom, but a huge burden for an independent Scotland? Ruth Davidson criticises the comment of John Swinney in terms of North Sea boom. Is she not aware it's precisely because of the £14 billion of investment that has lowered revenues in the short term, but will increase both production and revenues in the long term? That's why they're investing, can I say to Ruth, to get more oil and gas out of the North Sea. Profits for oil companies, certainly, but also revenues for the Scottish people. Assuming that is, we've got the common sense to make sure that it's a Scottish exchequer that receives these revenues, as opposed to burdening. And I wouldn't want to impose such a burden on future Tory chancellors in London.
Ruth Davidson. Order.
Well, let's talk about those revenues, because the First Minister says that he wants control of North Sea oil revenue to fund transformational policies. But let's look at his credibility, because his flagship pledge is extending childcare. We all want that. But this week we found out that his white paper plans were plucked out of thin air, without any sums being done. The First Minister might think that's credible, but I don't, and Scots know a chancer when they see one. This First Minister would have us believe in an oil boom that doesn't exist, in an oil fund with no money to pay for policies that he hasn't even costed. This First Minister pretends he's holding a full house, but isn't it the case that after yesterday his plans are a busted flush?
First Minister.
So, after yesterday, we know that over the last 5 years, Scotland would have been relatively better off by £8 billion, £1,600 a head for every man, woman and child in the country. Now, childcare, let's talk about this, because it's a very, very important issue. We have argued and substantiated it in terms of the production of the calculations, that in order to have a sustainable transformation of childcare, this can be afforded by using the mobilisation of women back into the workforce to increased employment and participation of 6% to generate £700 million of revenues. The difficulty we have at the present moment is only a small fraction of these additional revenues accrue to the Scottish Finance Minister. The vast majority go to George Osborne in London. Now, if Ruth Davidson can tell me and pledge that the first priority of George Osborne, if we can effect the transformation in childcare and the increased participation of women into the workforce in Scotland, would be to say, oh, I'm receiving an extra £700 million, I must immediately give it to the Scottish Parliament to make the policy sustainable, then that would be one thing. But we know from all of the evidence, including the last 30 years of £300 billion of oil revenues, that successive Chancellors said, here's the massive natural resources of Scotland, let's spend it on nuclear submarines.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister, in the light of an inaccurate report in the House of Commons on the discharge of alpha-emitting particulate from HMS Vulcan's nuclear test reactor 2 years ago, can the First Minister assure my constituents and the wider public that we can trust the Ministry of Defence and the UK Government with our environmental safety?
First Minister.
Well, can I say firstly that SEPA have informed stakeholders and will be reporting today on an incident in the civil aspects of Dounreay. They are not expecting this to have wide environmental implications. Indeed, the incident seems to have been safely contained. However, it does provide an illustration of openness and transparency, which is hugely important in dealing with these matters. And what a contrast between the ability to report on a civil incident and the inability caused by the secrecy of the Ministry of Defence to report on something covered by Crown immunity. Richard Lochhead put it extremely well in the statement he made the other day. Since then, we've had two developments. Mr Hammond has now corrected Hansard in terms of the information he gave to MPs last week. Now that the Defence Secretary has corrected the record, perhaps Conservative MSPs, and I heard Murdo Fraser this very morning, would now acknowledge that there was a mistake in the information given so belatedly to the House of Commons last week. However, in his correction, the Defence Secretary says there was no measurable change in the alpha-emitting particle discharge. This has caused great consternation in SEPA because Vulcan has no agreed authorised level of particle emissions, and to SEPA's best knowledge, Vulcan doesn't emit any of these particles. So even in this correction, there still seems to be a dedication to obfuscate and to conceal information. And that is why the process that Richard Lochhead outlined of removing that last vestige of Crown immunity would seem to be the most satisfactory way forward, so that community, Parliament and Government in Scotland can be secure that we are getting proper information in a timeous way, so that we understand can contain any risks to our natural environment.
Question 3, Willie Rennie.
to ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
The skill and ingenuity of people in Scotland means there's 130,000 more people in work. That's inside the UK, not outside. The GERS figures yesterday show the stability of the broad-based UK economy compared to the volatility of the Scottish finances. 1 year's problem on oil means £4 billion would need to be found from somewhere. Instead of searching for a crumb of comfort, why won't the First Minister answer the questions he's been dodging for the last 15 minutes? Which taxes would go up and which services would be cut?
First Minister.
Willie Rennie should have revised his questions after hearing the first two. I pointed out that over the last 5 years would be £8 billion better off, £1,600 ahead for every man, woman and child. I welcome, incidentally, and we've said on so many occasions, the positive increases in the Scottish economy, the record business confidence reported last week, the record demand for labour reported this week. I wonder if Willie Rennie did notice in the figures published yesterday that even with the £4 billion fall in oil revenues, the current budget balance for Scotland and the UK was virtually identical. What made the difference was an almost 1% greater increase in capital investment in Scotland. That's 1% greater than the UK. I think that was something to do with the Finance Secretary, Mr John Swinney, and the way he has managed to sustain capital investment despite UK cutbacks. And maybe that is part of the explanation why the Scottish recession was less deep than the UK, and we are now enjoying, according to all of the indicators, a substantial recovery.
I didn't change my question because he hadn't answered the question. The First Minister will say absolutely anything. His expert commission says the fiscal deficit needs to go down to create an oil fund. But yesterday, his party celebrated when it went up. In January, he said, ignore the economic figures for the last 5 years. Today, he says they're the only ones that count. Last year, they paraded the numbers for a single, isolated year. Today, he says only an idiot would do such a thing. He used to say, look at the facts. Now all he's got is excuses. The First Minister likes to quote the Bible. He usually casts himself as Moses. But isn't it the book of Daniel on this occasion? He has been measured and he has been found wanting.
First Minister.
I have to say, I think Willie Rennie must be confusing me with somebody else. I quote from many sources, and no doubt I quoted from the Bible. I don't think I've ever been a great biblical quoter. Maybe he's confusing me with one of his colleagues. I have absolutely no idea what he is talking about, to be absolutely frank. But can I say to Willie Rennie, this argument that we've just invented the first time to talk about the 5 years of figures. I said it at First Minister's questions this January, less than 2 months ago, and a range of references which I can supply him with over the last few years. It is obvious that because why do we know that we think looking at figures over a term is important? Because GERS publishes the figures for 5 years. Does that not give Willie Rennie a clue that the 5-year figure is actually quite important? Now, Willie Rennie says he doesn't like hearing about the £8 billion over the last 5 years. Can I say that is pertinent to the answer to his question? Instead of saying what we would have had to cut more than the UK, over the last 5 years, we would have had either £8 billion less of borrowing, which would have been a pretty good idea, or £8 billion more of investment, or more likely a combination of the two. Because if we'd had access to that £8 billion, then I'm sure even some of Johann Lamont's wee things could have been done in Scottish society to generate more employment, to get more participation and have some progress towards that prosperous and just society, which may or may not be in the Bible, but I'm sure Willie Rennie is equally aspiring to as me.
Question number 4 to immediate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the Child Poverty Action Group's finding that up to 100,000 children in Scotland could be pushed into poverty by 2020 as a result of the UK Government's austerity measures.
Well, it's unacceptable that any child should be living in poverty in a country as prosperous as Scotland. In recent years, the numbers of children in child poverty have fallen, as this Parliament as a whole has taken an approach focused on maximising household resources, improving children's life chances. The forecast from a number of sources, including the Child Poverty Action Group, that up to 100,000 children in Scotland could be pushed into poverty by 2020 should give every single member of this Parliament great concern. And as people rightfully look favourably and positively at the better indications we are seeing in the economy that we listed and I debated with Willie Rennie a few seconds ago, then we should also look very carefully at the social aspects of the welfare changes which are being predicted for us by economic institutes and the Child Poverty Action Group.
Briefly, Mr Eadie.
Minister, for that answer. Is it not a scandal that 40 years on from the National Children's Bureau report Born to Fail, so many of our children are still living in absolute poverty with poor educational achievement, diminished job prospects and shortened life expectancy? Isn't it time we took the powers of taxation and welfare into our own hands so that no more children are born to fail?
First Minister.
Well, I think it's important to remind the whole chamber of the progress that has been made. In 2001, there was 27% of children born into child poverty, relative child poverty in Scotland. That was 280,000 children. Now, progressively, over the years, and particularly, it should be said, over the last few years, that number has been reduced to 15%, 150,000. Now, all of us, I'm sure, would say that number should go to zero. That's where we'd want it. But that is substantial progress that's been made over the lifetime of this Parliament, and very substantial progress from 21% in 2006-07 to 15% in 2011-12. The difficulty is that the forecast from the Child Action Group is that the greater part of that progress is under risk of being lost by 2020. That is the point. And therefore, regardless of people's politics or views, are we actually going to tolerate a situation where, according to the forecast of the Child Poverty Action Group, that progress is going to be reversed? Or should we take the ability in this country, through control of the welfare system, to ensure that whatever else happens, the children of Scotland are not made to suffer the brunt of the economic recession we've endured?
Jackie Baillie.
The Deputy First Minister and I attended the launch of Poverty in Scotland this morning, and they made it clear that they didn't want the Scottish Government's focus on the independence debate to cloud the things we should be doing now. So why is it, over things you have control of now, like the Scottish Welfare Fund, like discretionary housing payments, that can make a difference to households with children, you can't get the money out the door into the pockets of people who need it most?
First Minister.
Everybody, the substantial majority of people across the voluntary sector appreciate and support the Scottish Government's efforts to mitigate the impact of the welfare changes from Westminster. Jackie Baillie stands alone in not arguing that this Parliament, that this Government is doing everything it can to try and take the edge off the welfare changes. But the ultimate reason that Jackie Baillie is in no position to deliver any strictures on this matter whatsoever is that she is the one who said Scotland could control social security but shouldn't control social security. And if she is prepared to maintain that position in the face of these forecasts, it tells you that someone who is prepared to put her constitutional obsession with Westminster Government before the interests of the Scottish people.
Question 5, Graeme Pearson.
To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to ensure that antisocial behaviour orders are not breached.
First Minister.
Well, the 2009 strategy for tackling antisocial behaviour, promoting positive outcomes, marked a real shift in the policy towards better solutions, recognising prevention, early and effective intervention and diversion should be at the heart of approaches to tackle antisocial behaviour. the number of crimes, breach of antisocial behaviour order recorded by Police Scotland has fallen by 30% from 2007-2008 and to 2012-2013.
Graeme Pearson.
I thank the First Minister for that response. In 2005, Mr McCaskill described ASBOs as being a short-term fix. On his watch, there have been more than 4,220 breaches of ASBOs, many of them repeated breaches, and a government ignorance of the number of ASBOs currently issued in Scotland. Only two-thirds of councils even bothered to reply to an FOI on the issue. Can the First Minister confirm whether tackling antisocial behaviour is still a priority for his government today, and does he plan to implement any changes to deal with these breaches?
First Minister.
Well, isn't it a good thing we've had the fall of 30% in breaches from 2007, 2008 to 2012, 2013? Now, if Graeme Pearson's position is that that level is unacceptable and could be improved, then I'll certainly agree. Let's see if we can improve it further. But equally, therefore, it must be Graeme Pearson's position that the 30% higher position that we inherited must be an even worse situation. And perhaps he could have a conversation with people like his leader who were in government office at that particular time. And I know that Graeme Pearson, because he has great knowledge of these things, will also acknowledge that recorded crime in Scotland is its lowest level for 40 years, down by 35% over that period. Above all, I think, in terms of the statistics, fear of crime is decreasing. Because of his professional experience, he knows that fear of crime, people being worried about their safety, is a hugely debilitating factor, particularly for older people in the population. And therefore, the encouraging statistics that we're seeing on fear of crime decreasing, people in Scotland more positive about their local areas, is something that I know he will be highly encouraged by, while, of course, urging the government on to see even greater improvement.
Question 6, Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will take account of the findings of the Lloyds Bank Affordable Cities review when allocating housing investment.
Minister.
Well, we've introduced a formula for allocating housing resources on the basis of need. Affordability certainly is one of the factors that should be taken into account, along with deprivation, rural affairs and homelessness.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you. House prices in Aberdeen have almost doubled over the past 10 years. Private sector rental rates are the highest in Scotland, and there is a lack of affordable social housing because of the Thatcher sell-offs. Can the First Minister assure me that Aberdeen's almost unique circumstances will be taken into account when resources for investment in housing are allocated, and can more be done to boost mid-market rental opportunities?
First Minister.
Well, I'm pleased to tell Kevin Stewart that the new formula that I described means that the share of affordable housing funding for Aberdeen's local programme will increase by almost 25% over the period between last year and 2017. I think that will be welcome news for people in Aberdeen. In addition, Aberdeen benefits from schemes such as Help to Buy, Open Market Shared Equity and the innovative National Housings Trust, and 85 homes for mid-market rent have been delivered in Aberdeen through that trust initiative alone. And I'm sure the local member will welcome that news on the 25% increase in terms of the affordable housing programme.
Thank you. That ends First Minister's questions. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should leave quickly and quietly.